Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Tonight is our Wow Worship service. We have this service every month, most noticeable not only by the music, but when Aaron joins us to help Cantor Kathy with the music. That's our Wow Worship service. But I want to remind us where the service came from. It was Cantor Kathy's idea in response to the questions that we so often get from people who've come to services for so long and not understood what the true meaning of our prayers are. They asked us, can you explain them more? From the kids in our religious school who have started to learn our prayers but want to practice saying them. From newcomers, people who are interested in Judaism, who would show up on a random Friday night and not be able to navigate the complex nature of a Jewish prayer service. We created this Wow Worship service to help uncover what's behind our prayers. And so tonight, I want to return to the core goal of that creation and talk about the next prayer that we'll say, the Aleinu, a prayer that perhaps those of us who've been regular in services throughout our lives, we say it without any thought. We've memorized the entire prayer. We know that in the third line, when we say the words Va'anachnu, that we all turn to bow. But what's the prayer about? Page 282 in our prayer book. I'll summarize the first paragraph. Let us now praise God, the Creator who has set us apart from the other families of the earth, giving us a destiny unique among the nations, Shelo asanu kogoye ha'artzot, who has set our family apart from the other families of the earth. In its early creation, the Aleinu was about finding our pride in being a people separated from other peoples. I was recently listening to this book, and the author shared the concept of being a person of color, an African American who was the only African American in his school. And he talked about it as a phrase. He said, I was the only. So many of us know what that feels like. Certainly, many of us from our Jewish experience know what it's like to be the only Jewish person in our class, to be the only Jewish family in our neighborhood, to be the only. So, not loneliness, but onlyness. When we are the sole representative, the sole person who can understand our perspective, and we know, or we assume at least, that anyone who's with us in these moments cannot possibly understand what it feels like to be a young African-American boy in a school filled only with Caucasian students. To be the only Jewish kid, especially in December, when everyone is celebrating Christmas. To be the only gay person in a community. To be the only woman in a boardroom. How many of us have experienced this onlyness? That's what the Aleinu responds to. But the truth is, it has not always been our favorite response. While at times we have wanted to be with others like ourselves, and the Aleinu was that response to say, we are here together, not alone. We've also struggled with the idea that we would want to be separated, that we, Shelo asanu kogoye ha'artzot, that we want to be separate from the other families. In fact, we want to be together with the other families of the world. And this isn't just something from our modern era. The rabbis tell a story about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Eliezer, who are looking out during the Roman era, and they can't stand what they see. They talk about the Romans as being self-absorbed, always building bigger buildings and gyms to work on their bodies and baths so that they can clean their bodies. They feel that the Romans have no proper values, no moral compass. And so they move into a cave. And for 12 years, Shimon lives with his son in the cave, separated from all the other people. And one day when they leave the cave, they go out and they see the world, and they're disgusted again. And it's at that moment that God's voice in the story comes forward and says, "How can you despise the world that I created?" In other words, don't be offended. Appreciate what's out there and find a way to find yourself in it. Today, we sometimes become victims of onlyness, of sometimes self-segregating, hiding in our caves, and we have to remind ourselves that that's not Jewish either. And we are often reminded of that moment, or perhaps I would say tested by that moment, when we see tragedies like we did earlier this week in the news of Asian Americans targeted. Because that tragedy, like when an African American church has been attacked and people have been murdered, it begs of us a question. What would our reaction have been if the 8 people killed in Atlanta were identified as having been targeted because they were Jewish Americans, not Asian Americans? Would our ears have perked up more? I thought about my own experience in Pittsburgh in particular. How immediately we tightened our security at Temple, how immediately we started sending emails out to the congregation and answering calls from news organizations. Our entire world became centered on what happened that day. But that didn't happen for me this week. Shelo asanu kagoyei ha'aratzot. In some ways, perhaps I and you took a deep breath and said the words of the Aleinu without knowing it. Thank God this wasn't an attack on my family. But that's not the Jewish way to look at it. In a post about the attack this week, Yehuda Kurtzer, a leading academic, Jewish thinker, he wrote the following, and I think it's exactly the right eye-opening message for us. He said, writing to our community, "The single most transformative experience for me in expanding my moral imagination," he says, "about the ethnic and racial background of others to whom I am obligated to feel responsible, was the act of marrying a Jew who came from a different ethnic background." That's what family is, he teaches. And he continues, "The untold truth about the American-Jewish intermarriage debate is that while American Jewry has not stopped talking about us and who we are, it has been all the while redesigning who we are." And so he writes, "I find it fascinating when people use the idea of the Jewish people as family to impose a politics of loyalty to the Jewish family, when in fact, the model of the family is one of relationship. It's a model of recreating your boundaries. We are born into one family construct, but we often construct the next family by ourselves, by choosing who we marry, by defining our new culture. Family is not a description of something closed off from others," he says, but a tool that opens ourselves up to the vulnerabilities of others. The response to our onlyness is to realize that we are not only one thing. We are not only a Jewish family, we are also a family that is Asian, because some Jews come from Asia. Some people marry people who are Asian Americans, and they become a part of their Jewish family. And some people from an Asian background choose to be parts of synagogues, to be members, to convert at times. We are Jewish and Asian and gay and straight and wealthy and poor and people of color, Latino, European, and American. We are not defined by just one name. We are an interfaith, interracial, diverse family. And so, can we see that in the tragedies and the celebrations that are in the news, that are in the world, that these are tragedies and celebrations that touch the very core of some of our family members? The beginning of Aleinu is challenging because it asks us to separate ourselves, to bless the fact that we're different. And sometimes that's good. It builds identity. It helps us connect to other Jewish people. But the end of Aleinu that we often share ends with these words. Al kein nikaveh lecha Adonai Eloheinu lirot mehera b'tiferet uzecha letakein olam b'malchut Shaddai. God, how soon we hope to behold the perfection of the entire world, guided by a sacred covenant drawn from human and divine meeting. A world where we do not just live in our Jewish cave, but one in which we take responsibility, feeling connected to a world that God made and one that we believe can one day be a place where everyone feels connected, everyone feels safe to be who they are in all their array. We turn now to page 282 as we share these very words, the words of Aleinu, that remind us to connect to our Jewish family, but also to remind ourselves that our Jewish family is far more than Jewish. It is in fact connected to the entire world. Please rise and share these words with us.